So I got a very interesting story that is going back to 2010, but just came full circle in really an incredible way that I just got to share. I first decided to really take my faith seriously in 2010. I'd met Whitney, and she was talking to me about how her faith was the most important thing in her life, and I danced around the reality that mine wasn't. I was raised in the church. My parents did the best they could. It always sort of didn't sink in and was kind of like something I'd put on the back burner. And I actually imagined that I would meet a woman who was better than I was that would drive all this, if I'm completely transparent. And so she was that person. And it led me into a church. I prayed, and without a doubt, God led me into a specific church. And I know that because when Whitney asked me what church I went to, and I kind of hemmed and hawed and said that, I lived in the city and didn't have one and whatever, she said, why don't you pray about it? And I knew how to pray. And so I did. And I said, Lord, where should I go to church? Help me. I could do a Google search. I can look in my neighborhood. And I did those things. But I said, where do you want me to go? And it wasn't like 48 hours later that I was on the subway and I overheard two guys talking about going to a church at the Temple, like the building on Temple's campus that gave it, that it's named after, this building that I'd wanted to see for architectural reasons. Like I had always heard it was a pretty impressive building. And so it just really it struck me, and I went online later and I looked it up and I decided to go there, despite that it was like way out of the way for me. Something clicked. I went. Turns out they had the time wrong on their website. So I was there an hour early. I'm like checking online, like says the right time. I get there, they're just setting up, the choir's like warming up, and I was just trying to hide in the back. And some older guy came over and just started like talking to me, and I tried to like not engage. He was persistent. Long story short, the service starts, and like halfway through it, I just start crying, and I'm like, what? Why am I crying? Like I don't cry. And this guy later made a couple introductions for me after the service, and I remember walking out and looking down Broad Street, and the sun was, and the sun was shining. I just felt like God had me exactly where He wanted me. I'll never forget that feeling. It was so crazy. Well, it wasn't a week later that I started to meet Whitney's friends, and I was like, wow, you have the most incredible friends. Like, they love you. They were doing things for her, praying for her, supporting her, encouraging her. And I just didn't have those kinds of friends. Like, no one was really checking up on me in the same way. And I'm not belittling the friends that I had friends, but it was much more like drinking buddies, and I think a lot of guys go through this where they really examine like who's got my back. And I said that to Whitney. I'm like, I'd love to have friends like you have. And she's like, why don't you pray about it? So I literally prayed. I'm like, Lord, I just want some guys that I can be real with and hang out with, who also want to get in the Word and study Scripture so I can understand it. And it wasn't, again, 48 hours that I start getting phone calls from these guys that I'd been introduced to at the church. And they're like, hey, dude, we want to get together and just hang out and play Ultimate Frisbee, and let's get in the Word. And, and I remember I started to get, they said to me, when can we meet with you? And my schedule was just crazy at that time. And they eventually said, well, look, why don't we come over at like 5:30 in the morning and we can do it then? And I was like, is this a joke? Is this some kind of like, hazing thing? And I was like, not a morning person. I'd show up at my job at 9, work late. And yet on the days when these guys started to come, I'd be up at like 5 or 4:30, wide awake, couldn't go back to sleep. And I was like, this is not me. So I just started making breakfast. Like, so these guys would show up at 5:30, and I'd have breakfast like half the time. And got in the Word with them, saw that they were super serious. Like, they were in the Word. Like, they were like serving in the community. They were helping each other, encouraging each other, hanging out a couple nights a week, and they took it so seriously. Well, the interesting thing is that relatively quickly, within a few months, I'd say I got to the point where I was like, I'm reading the word for myself. I want to know what this stuff says. And I got to a place where I'm like, I want to be baptized again. I want to give my life to the Lord, and I want to make this publicly known. Even though I was baptized as a baby, I'm an adult. I want to make this decision on my own. I saw that Jesus and others in Scripture did that, and it just made sense to me. And I told these guys that. I was like, I want to do this. And they met, and I believe prayerfully came back to me and said, we're not going to baptize you. Not exactly what you expect, right? And I took it pretty seriously. They actually encouraged me to consider praying very seriously about this, and even fasting. And that was kind of the first time I had really thought about that. And I did. I fasted. I forget for how long, but it was days. I didn't eat, and I just prayed, and I said, God, what is going on here? And they had a couple reasons why they felt like I wasn't all in, that I wasn't completely just willing to give up my life for the Lord. And I remember thinking, they felt like work was more important, and they felt like, Whitney was more important, and some things I was willing to sacrifice were more important. And, what is this worth building on a solid foundation or not, and Scripture you can make that case. Well, I ended up, at the time I was going to 2 churches because I'd go visit Whitney occasionally and stay at her parents' while I did. And that was, part of it. And I went to a church with her, and I remember wasn't that long after that, there was a pastor that got up, and he basically looked out, and I swear he was looking right at me, and he's like, some of you want to get baptized, and we're going to do it next weekend. And it was July the 3rd, 2011 at that point, and I was like, sign me up. So I got baptized. Well, I went back to the church, the other church where these dudes were from, and they were pissed, like it didn't go over real well. And one guy in particular who I really admired, and just his zeal, and the way he took things so seriously, was really pissed. Like he even said to me at one point, he's like, we don't believe the same things. Like, how can I call you brother? I don't know, what you believe. And, obviously I was pretty bummed about it. But, and at first I was like, dude, you don't know like what's in my heart. Although really quickly I was like, you know what? It's okay. I want to have peace with this guy, with all these guys. I'm gonna keep hanging out. But it started to sort of fade away, and in fact it got to the point where like this guy, on Facebook, I noticed that he wasn't like commenting on any of my stuff. Like, he wasn't engaged in my life. I would email him and he wouldn't reply like via Facebook. So eventually I defriended him, and I was like, I wasn't sure about that, but I thought he's not engaged in my life, But I didn't have any resentment. Honestly, as the years went by, I actually looked back on it and I could see their perspective, and I think there were some things they were really right about. But it also caused me to sort of say, man, God has been so active in my life, that, if I were them, what does it help me to sort of understand about the way God works on people and in their hearts? And I sort of felt like, man, maybe there's some formulas or some things we think sometimes that maybe aren't, so clear. And it was really helpful for me to think through. And I remember at one point, a friend of mine, I told this story to, and he's like, I'm surprised you didn't just walk away from church, after that experience. And I was like, dude, it wasn't even about these guys. I mean, yeah, it was tough, but like, when God had shown himself to me in some really clear ways, like that wasn't an option. Not to mention the fact that Whitney's faith was serious, and I knew, and I saw the result of that in her life. Um, so get this. Fast forward to about 2 months ago, I moved back to the East Coast. I get this message on Twitter from this guy who I befriended, and he's like, "Hey, I see you're back east. Let's get together." And I was like, a little excited, a little bit wondering what's going on, and knowing the way the Lord works, sort of like, all right, Lord, like, what's going on? Told Whitney about it, and she kind of got, her interest peaked and stuff, um, and so I met with him, and it was just a really rich time. It was basically like just catching up. But at one point, he basically said to me, he's like, "Look, I learned a lot through that," and he just said to me that his views have changed a little bit, and really how at that time, the emphasis on the hierarchy uh, in some of the systems that existed have been challenged since then. And so and he even sort of apologized that I had to be on sort of the receiving end of that learning. And I told him, I'm like, no, I think that's the way it was supposed to be, because when I fasted and prayed about it, it caused me. I sought out another pastor to give me some advice about the situation, and he said to me, "Why don't you pray that God shows you how to bring him into your work?" Right? So, because one of the things the guys were saying is, you just work too much, dude. Like that's clearly your God, and he said, "Look, you're in a season where you can't work less. Like you've got yourself in this situation. So why don't you pray that God shows you how to bring him into your work more?" And I was like, that makes so much sense. I like that. I felt like I was short with my staff at times and stuff. So I liked that a lot. Well, I started praying that, and it wasn't like 6 months later that I got a recruiter that contacted me out of the blue to apply for this job that was an application for ministry. And as soon as I read it, I was like, I there goosebumps. I was like, "Are you serious, Lord? I've been praying to bring you into my job, and this is what you want me to do?" And I was getting ready to get married, and there was so many unknowns. I didn't think that it was going to be. There's a lot of problems with this, but I knew almost right away that I was going to be doing this ministry job, and sure enough, I ended up doing that. And so I look back and I can say, these guys and their role, however difficult and challenging it was to me, I believe was God's plan. And how sweet it was then, you know 5 years later, to be reconciled with this brother, and even further, to get to a place now where I'm like, I just love this guy. I want to bless him, like whatever I can do, and I'm just so thankful that God brought things full circle. So I just share that because a lot of times people get turned off by the church. They get uh, you know turned sideways, and I don't think we can always, yeah, we're supposed to love each other, and that's important, but sometimes, like, these things happen, and we have to realize that sometimes God is in that too, and you know each of us, like, and he can make good out of any situation, and to really seek him, one on one, and not equate God with the church and the people in it per se, I think is key too. So just sharing like a real kind of like a praise story, because this did turn out in a really nice way. So I'm meaning to share that now. Hope it's a blessing to y'all.